Welcome everyone to the Housing Decision Guides webinar. This is the second webinar in the September and October series discussing approaches to combating elder financial exploitation. This webinar will be recorded and shared with registrants after the session. For today's webinar, there are a few pods in Adobe Connect that you may use. First, you'll see the slides in the middle of the screen, and then to the bottom left, you'll see the Q&A box. Please insert content-related questions into the Q&A box, and we'll answer them during the Q&A portion. To the right of that box, you'll see the EFPRN, FAQs, and links with common questions, answers, and important links. You'll see the link for the housing guides that we discussed today in that box. To the right, you'll see the chat box. Feel free to say hello to your fellow participants. Let us know where you're calling in from, which organization you're with. And now I'd like to welcome Lisa Schifferly, Senior Policy Analyst in the Office for Older Americans at CFPB. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicole. Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Schifferly, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst in the CFPB's Office for Older Americans. I'll be the moderator today, and I'd like to welcome you to the CFPB's Elder Justice webinar series. Today's webinar is on the new just-in-time housing decision guides, and those are 4 resources to help older adults and their caregivers navigate some of the important housing decisions that can affect their later life financial security. So each guide, as you'll hear, outlines the potential challenges that older adults might face in making that particular decision. And then it outlines options, noting the pros and cons of each option. The guides also list places older adults can go for counseling, legal help, and other types of support. So you'll hear all about these guides today from my colleague, Cora Hume, who I will introduce shortly. But before we begin, I do have to give this disclaimer, which basically says that this presentation is being made by a CFPB representative on behalf of the CFPB, but it does not constitute legal interpretation, and any opinions or views stated by the presenters are the presenter's own and may not necessarily represent the Bureau's views. So with that, let me tell you what you are going to hear about today. We'll start by talking a little bit about the CFPB. I'll give you a brief introduction, and then I'll turn it over to Cora, who will give you some background about trends in older adult home ownership, and then talk about the process we went about in order to develop the housing decision guides, and then walk you through each of the 4 housing decision guides so you can see what they're like and what a great resource they are. And we will end with time for questions and answers. So please do submit your questions into the Q&A box, and we will take them at the end of the presentation. So let me introduce you to Cora Hume. The presenter today is my colleague Cora Hume, who's an attorney with the CFPB's Office for Older Americans. She joined the CFPB in 2012, and prior to joining, she was the legislative director at the National Association of Consumer Advocates, or NACA, which is a membership organization of consumer protection attorneys. Ms. Hume has over 20 years of advocacy and legal experience in consumer protection, elder voting rights, labor, and fair housing law. In fact, she and I worked together at Maryland Legal Aid about 20 years ago, so I can attest that she is a wonderful consumer advocate, and we're very lucky to have her here presenting today's webinar. So now that you know a little bit about us, let's go to our first poll to find out a little bit about you. Please let us know how you would describe your organization. We're trying to get a sense of the audience. And so far, this looks similar to the audiences we've had on other webinars in the series, with the greatest majority being financial institutions, followed by other, and then some APS, area agencies on aging, a variety of prosecution, payments industry, and law enforcement, but a lot of financial institutions, and we welcome you here to this presentation, a lot of other as well. So we will be interested to hear more about who those other people are on this webinar. So thank you for introducing yourselves. And before I hand it over to Cora to talk about the housing guides, I just want to give you a little bit of background about the CFPB, or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. If you've been on a webinar series, you probably already know this, but for those who aren't so familiar with the CFPB, we are a federal agency that helps make sure that banks and lenders treat everyone fairly. So we implement and enforce federal consumer financial law with the emphasis on the financial laws, and also ensure that markets for consumer financial products are fair, transparent, and competitive. So as you see on this slide, we like to think of ourselves as being on your side through life's financial moments. We were created in 2010 with passage of Dodd-Frank, which was drafted in response to the challenges that came up during the Great Recession of 2007 and 2008. And the CFPB's core functions are how we achieve our mission. So our work includes all the items here on this slide, including rooting out unfair, deceptive, or abusive acts or practices by writing rules, by supervising companies, and by enforcing the law by bringing cases against companies that discriminate in consumer finance or that treat consumers unfairly. We also do take consumer complaints related to financial products and services. You can file complaints at consumerfinance.gov/complaint. And we do financial education, research, and monitoring as well. So the Office for Older Americans, where Cora and I work, is the part of the agency where we focus on issues of importance for those 62 and older. The Dodd-Frank Act, which created the CFPB, actually specifically created the Office for Older Americans too. And the law mandates that we collaborate with others in the aging field. So we're really thrilled to be here today, fulfilling that mission. It is our goal to help protect older consumers from financial harm and help them navigate key financial moments as they grow older. So our work on the housing decisions guides is consistent with those goals and missions that I just outlined. So now I will hand it over to Cora to give you some background on older adult home ownership and to tell you all about these great new housing decision guides. Cora?
Yep, great. Thanks, Lisa. Like Lisa said, I just want to sort of set the stage before we get into the housing guides. And I've been watching the chat to see who's on this webinar, and it's a real pleasure to see such a diverse group of people interested in this topic, and it's a real pleasure to be here. So let's get going. Okay, so we're going to start with a poll question, just for fun. How many older adults own their own home? What is your guess here? And then the next slide will give you the answer in a minute. Looks like 60% is in the lead. Okay. So it looks like poll results are generally, the majority think that 60% is in the lead. Well, you'll be surprised then that 80% of consumers who are 65 and older own their own home. So we're talking about someone we know, right? Our parents, our grandparents, neighbors, aunts, uncles, someone we love is an older adult who owns their home. And really the question that we're trying to tackle here is what do they do with their equity as they age? What have they done to think about what they're going to do with their home as they age? And there's, the question is, not only an emotional one to make that decision, but also a financial and physical one. So we're going to move to another question. Is a house usually a homeowner's largest asset or expense? So let's give a moment for that. Okay, I don't think we have to wait too much longer. It's apparent that home is both the largest asset and expense is the majority. And as this slide reflects, the answer is both. Here you can see in this slide that the home is the most valuable asset. in 2019, which is the latest data that we had, 20% of all assets held by consumers age 65 and older was home equity. So we're talking a lot more than, as you can see on this slide, other types of assets that older adults might hold. And again, using 2019 data, the housing wealth for the population of age 65 and older was about $9 trillion. So that's gone up since then. But clearly we're talking about a lot of money. And then moving into the largest expense, as you can read on this slide, not only is it a huge asset, but it's an expense, and those expenses don't stop growing over time. So as an older homeowner might enter retirement and be on a fixed income, the housing costs can continue in terms of taxes and insurance and upkeep. So it might get more and more difficult for older adults to handle the housing expenses as they transition to a more fixed income. Along with being an asset and an expense, a lot of older adults, especially the baby boomers, are entering retirement without pensions, and which were more common, obviously, among previous generations, and with retirement shortfalls. So in the absence of these savings and pension plans, the home can really become a safety net or be considered a safety net for older adults. Okay, I think this is our last polling question. What percentage of older adults want to age in place? Okay, it looks like this one is a clear winner again with 90%. So we can end the poll. And those of you who voted that are correct. Nearly 90% of people over 65 want to stay in their home. And when we talk about aging in place, it doesn't necessarily have to be the home that they've been in for the last 50 years or 60 years. It can be also downsizing to a smaller home or even renting, but it's really staying out of institutional care. So when we talk about aging in place, but most people do imagine it's the home that they're in. And when people want to age in place, again, it's an emotional decision that goes into it. But, what does it mean to age in place? Our needs as we age, our physical needs change, our healthcare needs change. And how are those going to be tackled? How are they going to be paid for? Does the homeowner have insurance to cover that, long-term care insurance? Or are they planning on a family member or a friend being a caregiver? How are those costs really going to be financed? And that's a big consideration in terms of aging in place. So obviously, this is a very complicated issue that is an emotional one, but also has very significant financial implications. And why are we talking about it today in terms of fraud prevention? So obviously the home is the biggest asset, so it's a very good target. And as older adults age, some of them become more isolated, as you know, again, making them a better target. And then older adults might be hitting different crisis points as they age. For example, a death of a spouse, a change in healthcare, the need to keep their house in good repair. And so that opens them up to scams. As you know, crises, make people feel panicked and might not allow them to really make the best decision for them. So the types of scams that we're talking about in terms of home ownership could be something like equity stripping. I definitely saw this as a legal aid attorney back in the early 2000s. Transfer of title without the homeowner's knowledge, purchasing the home for below the market value, and home modification scams. Those are pretty common too. And especially after a natural disaster, those affected by the natural disaster being preyed on for all sorts of scams, including home repair. So let's move to the housing decisions guide. So that kind of sets the stage of, the population we're talking about and the needs and desires of that population. So we began this research in 2019. We really wanted to tackle the issue. And so we started by doing an environmental scan. We looked at 150 resources to identify strengths and gaps in the tools that are currently available to older adults. We also conducted interviews, both with older adult homeowners, but also their family members and intermediaries who work with older adults. And as you can see, a lot of older adults don't have a plan for housing as they age. This isn't really surprising. A lot of people make decisions when it's forced upon them. But this lack of planning opens older adults up to fraud and scams. So, one thing that we want to encourage is older homeowners do come up with a plan. So whatever comes their way, they're prepared. So when we went into making these guides, we really wanted to design materials that helped older adults think ahead. So in the planning process, we created some personas based off the interviews that we had with older adults and their caregivers and intermediaries to reflect common themes among them. And these personas help guide us in terms of designing the housing guides. And I just want to quickly highlight them so that way you can see, maybe see these personas in the populations that you serve and make you aware that these guides might be best suited for these types of personas. So we're going to start with Never Thought About It, Norman. And I just want to note that this empty box, the empty word bubble, doesn't mean that Norman generally isn't a thoughtful guy, doesn't think about his household finances. We're just talking about housing here. And many people fell into this category, both men and women, about never thinking about it. They didn't have a ready response for how they would use equity in their home, and they just didn't have a plan. So what does Norman need and what does he want? He doesn't have many wants because he's not looking for information. But what he needs is information about his options and how to prepare for a crisis affecting his ability to stay in his home, whether that's financial or physical. Our next persona is Aging in Place Anne. She assumes that she'll stay in the home and pass it down to her children. Home ownership is important to her. She takes pride in owning her own home. And she's not planning on relying on her home as a safety net. She really wants to pass it down to her kids. So her wants and needs. She wants information on ways to lower her housing costs so she can stay in her home. She wants information about options to pay for physical modifications for her home so she could stay there. And she needs information, again, on how to prepare for crises that affect her housing. Third persona, and there are 4 personas, so we're halfway done. The persona Help Me Harvey. He is facing some immediate challenges or crises, whether that's health issues, but also loss of a job, unexpected expenses that lead to financial strain. We definitely saw this during the COVID pandemic in terms of all 3 of those. So putting a financial strain that forces some decision making. He's not looking for help. Basically, his head is in the sand. He's one of those guys who's just not even opening his mail. So what he wants is he needs some immediate help. He needs to learn his options fast, and they need to be unbiased. He needs to find help from the trustworthy and reliable sources because he's real susceptible to exploitation, again, being in this crisis situation. And lastly, we've got it. I've got it. Irene, she's on top of it. She's thought things through. She has some reliable information that she gets from family and friends and professionals, and she doesn't really feel the need to look anywhere else. So she is our model older adult homeowner. But, it would be helpful for her to have some confirmation that she's on the right track. She did, still could use some reliable information if she's willing to look at it. And, the big picture of all her options would be helpful. All right, so those are the people that we're trying to serve here with these housing decision guides. So we entered then the second phase of creating the guides, and we worked with national experts across the country, both in the aging field and the consumer protection field, to develop content for these just-in-time guides. So we decided that what was really needed and what wasn't out there was just-in-time, where it meets the older adult where they're at. There wasn't a lot of just-in-time resources out there. There are lots of resources that talked about one option, for example, a HELOC or a reverse mortgage, but one that didn't really show the larger picture of all options available. So we created content. We user tested it with older adults to make sure that it made sense and it was really useful for them. We then translated it into 8 different languages in addition to English, and those translations should be done within the next week or 2 and up on ready for distribution. We allowed them these guides to be available for downloads, but they also are available for print and bulk orders. And as you can see, the 4 guides we created are known pain points with older adults: loss of a spouse or partner, navigating a change in health. A lot of older adults are concerned about how to leave their home to their children or heirs. And then, as we talked about, this financial safety net. So one other thing I wanted to, highlight before I moved on was we recently got approved to co-brand these guides. And so we will have probably within the next week or so, a vanity URL, which will lead you to the guide on how to co-brand. So looking at the people attending financial institutions, you can co-brand this with us and put it in your banks and your credit unions on a resource shelf. Legal services, as a legal services attorney, I most certainly would have had these guides on my resource shelf. Libraries as well, area agencies on aging. So the more that it's co-branded, the better, because you all on this call are trusted resources for your community, and having your insignia and your name on this would really further the trust of these guides. So we're really excited to co-brand, and we can follow up with you all with the URL. So I'm just going to quickly highlight what's in these guides so you get a sense of them. And again, they're already available for download, and I'll have the URL available at the end of this presentation. But it's consumerfinance.gov /housing decision. But again, that's coming in another slide. So let's start with the housing decisions after losing a spouse. Really, common occurrence as we age, people die. And so this guide helps homeowners consider their options and determine whether staying in their home makes sense for them, both emotionally, physically, and financially. So we tackle each of those issues in this guide, and we provide prompt questions to help them raise some issues. So we don't tell an older adult what to do. We want them to come to the decision that's best for them, and each individual is going to have a different story and a different fact pattern. And so it's really, they have to individualize it. But these prompts help people think about, help them move towards the decision. So in terms of emotional prompts, we talk about, does the home give you fond memories? Or does it give you more feelings of loss? Will moving make it easier or harder to see family or friends? So looking at the emotional aspects of it. And there are many more prompts. I'm just highlighting a couple. Then there's the physical, was my spouse my caregiver? Did my spouse do all the upkeep on the home? Did he or she maintain the yard? Is it hard for me to go up the stairs? Is it hard for me to maneuver around my house? What about, is it hard to run errands, manage my own meds, cook in the kitchen? All those questions fall into the physical prompts. And then we have the financial, loss of a spouse or partner often means loss of an income. So how does that affect covering the cost of aging in place? And what should I do if I can't afford the home? Where can I look? What resources are out there? How can I budget? So in every guide, we provide links to both CFPB resources as well as non-government resources. For example, in this one, budgeting, how to get help modifying the home, consulting a HUD certified housing counseling. There's all sorts of resources at the end of each guide where people can follow up with, for example, area agencies on aging, a HUD housing counselor to learn more, right? This is just the start of a conversation to get them thinking, not to provide them all the answers that they may need. So we have the healthcare issue too. This guide is really built to help homeowners consider their housing options, whether they're currently going through a medical crisis or going to be facing an imminent one. So there's a checklist to help homeowners think through their needs after a change in health. There's a chart highlighting what medical needs might be needed and what non-medical at-home care might be needed. So we're talking about distribution of medicine, or for non-health care, what about aid getting dressed, daily living needs, cooking, cleaning. So we dive into the medical versus non-medical needs for at-home care. And then it discusses options for moving to a housing arrangement that might be more suitable to a homeowner's medical and personal needs. And so then we dive into those options. For example, moving in with family or friends, moving into assisted living and what that means, moving into CCR, which is a community residential facility, or a nursing home. So it really goes into what those would entail and what each of those options does to meet people's needs. Okay. So third guide is leaving the home to the heirs. Again, a lot of older adult homeowners are concerned about what happens to the house after they die. This really dives into people's options and talks about the legal and tax implications. And it's a complicated subject in terms of leaving a home to someone after death. So one of the main points in this guide is to talk to a professional, whether that is an attorney or a tax advisor or someone who has expertise in both. But the guide will not be able to dive into the details of tax implications, for example. But it does talk about timing of when a homeowner can maybe sell or gift the home and how that might affect Medicaid eligibility. It also flags, asking the person's child or heirs, what they would do after they got the home. And sometimes that can really influence what the person does. And you can see here on the slide, we dive into each of these options in terms of leaving the home in a will, a gift, selling the home, placing the home in a trust. And in some states, they allow for a transfer on death deed, which is not in many states, but is an option. So it talks about each of those options, again, the timing, ramifications, and how that might play out. Okay, last guide. Using home equity to meet financial needs. Again, a lot of baby boomers as they age, we know are going to have retirement shortfalls. So they're going to turn to their home as another source of income. And so it goes into 4 options. It talks about cash out refinances, home equity loans, home equity lines of credit, and reverse mortgages. And then it creates, we have a chart and then goes into a deeper dive in terms of eligibility for each of those products, how the homeowner may receive the money, whether their monthly payments, and what happens to the loan balance over time. So again, this one really provides a big picture of the options, which is a resource that's really not out there. So super helpful for deciding what might be best fit given the older homeowner's needs. So those are the 4 guides. And here, as I promised, is the website link and a URL. Right now, the guides are up in English, and probably in the next 2 weeks, the other 8 languages will be up there. And then we will also have a vanity URL, much like this, for the co-branding. So we're really excited for that prospect. And I think here's a slide on how you can reach us. If we don't get to all your questions today, please feel free to email our inbox at olderamericans@cfpb.gov. We do have resources on reverse mortgages. So if you're printing out these guides, there's some really great guides on what is a reverse mortgage. And if you have one, there's a separate guide on now that you have one, what are your rights and your obligations. So, and then always is a great resource is the Ask CFPB questions. I use it even as an employee of the CFPB. If I have a question that I'm not really sure the answer of, I'll start with the Ask CFPB Q&A. They're consumer facing. I find them very easy to understand. And then, as always, we always want to highlight our complaint process. So if there's any problems that your clients are having, they can always file a complaint with us. So right now, I think we are going to turn to Q&As, and happy to answer any questions people might have.
Thanks so much, Cora. What a great presentation. And I think we can turn our cameras on now for the Q&A portion of the presentation. So thank you. I really enjoyed that and actually sent 2 of the guides to family members as the presentation went on because they are so helpful. But let me start with some of the questions I already see in the chat, and people can please add your questions to the Q&A box and we will get to them as we see them. So let's start with one question that I see, which is that you, as someone who works in law enforcement, do you have any recommendations on how best to tell the difference between a legitimate equity use product or one that's a fraud?
Yeah, so good question. Well, I always like to start with, from my legal aid days, if it's too good to be true, it usually is too good to be true. So that's always a red flag. But there are lots of products, or there are some products out there that make sense for some people, but are more predatory or problematic for other consumers. So, for example, a reverse mortgage is a good product for some people. As a legal aid attorney, I put some of my clients into reverse mortgages to save their home from foreclosure. But in other instances, if a consumer is being put into a reverse mortgage and then refinanced several times, that becomes an equity stripping scheme. So, take a look at the details of how the product is being used. We saw that with forward mortgages too, right? In terms of equity stripping. A lot of my clients, back when I was in legal aid in Maryland, were being refinanced multiple times, which refinancing is a legitimate product as well, and makes sense for some people. But if it's 3-4 times, that's definitely a red flag as well. So.
Yes, thanks. And I remember some equity stripping cases where people would think they were making home repairs, like for new windows, and they were told they were getting a senior discount, but then really the company was borrowing against the equity in their home, and the person didn't even realize it till they came to legal aid. So that's another example. So here's another question. You talked about co-branding. So can you tell us a little bit more about that opportunity to co-brand the housing decision guides and what people should know, and anything else you want to share on that?
It's going to be on the cover. There's going to be room for you to put your brand, your insignia. So it's going to be I read the instructions the other day just before they're finalized, and it seems like a pretty simple process where we've made room for your insignia and you put it on the cover and everything else stays the same. So we'll send out that URL that leads you through that process. But our materials are public. And again, I think co-branding makes a lot of sense in communities. A lot of people don't know who the CFPB is. and they know who you are, right? And you are trusted. They're in your institution, whether it's a library or a bank or, an area agency on aging. So co-branding makes sense, especially if you're able to print them on your own and get them out into your offices. I'm thinking of financial institutions again, having them on a resource rack in the bank, in the lobby, in the waiting room. So, and if co-branding doesn't make sense for you, if that's not something that you have capacity to do, then you can order these guides in bulk. And we can ship them to you in hard copy, and then you can put them on your resource list. Or on your resource rack. So, for example, libraries, that might be a better option. So 2 options, but we're really excited about this opportunity to co-brand because I think it will get the guides out into the community in a much more thorough way.
Thanks. That's a great point too about the organizations out there being trusted in their communities. So the co-brand really does help with that. And consumerfinance.gov/order is the URL if people want to order any of the free guides, and it's free shipping as well. So another question we have is, where's a good place to send someone to learn more about their housing options and available financial products so they get to reputable information and not to scams?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Well, you always have legal services. Obviously, Lisa and I are big fans and believers in legal services. And legal services, area agencies on aging, are great ways to get people to where they need to go. Housing counselors. I mean, HUD housing counselors are such a knowledgeable resource. Again, unbiased, reputable, well-trained. So as a legal services attorney, I sent lots of people to housing counselors because they didn't have a legal need, but they needed some counseling. So I think those are all great places to start to get your clients to additional information.
Thanks. And here's another great question. Someone's asking, how can these materials and guides be presented to communities? Can they link to the guides on their website?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So you can link to the CFPB consumerfinance.gov/housing decision. Decision or decisions, I can't remember at this present moment. It's on the slide that I showed you. It's housing decisions with an S. Yeah, please link to it on your website. The more we get these out, the better. We created them for you to get to people who need them. So the more people who can get them any way they can, the better. And again, I think one thing to remember is it's not just older adult homeowners. My parents are in their 80s, so I am a prime audience for these guides. I want to help my parents navigate decision making as they age in their home. And so I think a lot of children of older adults, homeowners, could really use these guides. Not just children, I mean, family members that help their loved ones navigate this space.
Thanks. We have a question asking, what can be done for a client who may be unsafe at home but doesn't want to move into a nursing home? And do these guides cover how to have these kinds of housing and financial discussions?
I think the healthcare one at least talks about, the needs that might arise, medical and non-medical, and then the options. So I think it could be a good way to start the conversation and to leave it with that older adult and have them sit with it really. And, these are really emotional decisions. But there's a reality too, right? What happens if the bathroom's not accessible and you are now mobility impaired? So I think the guide really can just let the person sit with the ideas and think about it and give them their options. And there might be a middle ground, right? It might be that they have to move out of that home, but they can downsize into an apartment that's fully accessible, or in a senior housing complex that gives them a community. So I think it's a good place to start, but it doesn't give a full map of how to have these conversations. But I think it would happen organically with that guide being given to that person.
Thanks. We have a question asking, since many older adults have failing eyesight, are these available in larger print size, these guides?
That's a great suggestion. No, but thank you for that, and I will look into that. I don't know if the Bureau
And
is
I think,
printed in my print. Lisa, do you?
I mean, I think that a lot of the older Americans publications are in larger print than our other publications because they are for an older adult audience. At least I've been told before that there's like a different template for older adults publications, which includes a larger font. It's not large print though, like Cora was saying, but it is larger than normal, keeping in mind that issue.
We'll
So
take it back. Just so you know,
yes.
we'll raise that and see what could happen there.
And we have a question here about, are you aware of funding sources for home accessibility modifications so an older adult can stay in their home?
Yeah, so that's go to the Change in Health Guide, and those resources are at the back. So the take a look, and the answers are there. But there are all sorts of state resources, so we don't really talk about that. So I would, in terms of that, go to your area agency on aging and see what kind of local and state resources are out there. And AARP has a great checklist that we highlight in terms of narrowing down what kind of modifications need to be done to the home. So
Thanks. That's the nice thing about the guides. They have resources at the end of each one to refer people to things like sources for home modifications. So we're getting a lot of good questions, and people can feel free to keep putting them in the Q&A box. But one that I see is that, do the guides discuss executing wills or power of attorneys for decision making?
So we do talk in leaving the home to heirs, wills and probate. But in terms of that, Lisa, maybe I can pass it to you because that's really managing someone else's money. So we have other guides that might help in that respect.
Sure, that's what I was going to add, is that we do have our Managing Someone Else's Money series of guides, which you can find at consumerfinance.gov/MSEM, like managing someone else's money. And those go through people's rights and responsibilities if they are serving as power of attorney, if they're serving as guardian or conservator or a trustee or a representative payee. So there are 4 different guides for different types of financial caregivers. And they're really designed for regular, ordinary people who are thrust into these roles and want to know what it is they're supposed to do so they can do it responsibly. We also have a newer guide called Considering a Financial Caregiver, Know Your Options, which goes through some of the informal caregiving options like trusted contacts, convenience accounts, as well as the formal caregiving like power of attorney and the rest. So I would encourage people to check those out again at consumerfinance.gov/MSEM. And I see one more question. I'm not sure if we can answer this or not, but if not, people can always consult with a trusted elder law attorney in their state or a trust and estates attorney in their state. But someone is asking, what are the differences between a transfer on death deed versus putting the property into a trust? Advantages, disadvantages?
Yeah, we talk about that briefly in the guide. I don't know specifically how many states allow transfer on death deed. It's similar to a trust. I think it's process-wise easier, but I would say if your state has it, you should refer that older adult homeowner to a professional. But similar, I think that transfer on death deeds are very limited in what states allow them, but we wanted to include it because for some people they will apply. So
great, thank you. Thanks for answering all those questions. We do have some resources that we want to share with people before we close. So with that, we're going to close out the Q&A portion. As Cora said, you can always send questions to our older Americans at cfpb.gov email address if you have any after the presentation. But we do want to make sure to let you know about these resources. First of all, there's the YouTube resources. If you have not been on all the other webinars in our series, you can find them on the CFPB's YouTube channel. This particular webinar has been and is being recorded, and you'll get an email with a link to it after the presentation. So if you missed any of it, or if you have a colleague who you think would enjoy watching it, you can check out that link that will come to you by email automatically. And you'll also get links to the other presentations, which you can find on the CFPB's YouTube channel. We also want to let you know about an upcoming webinar. This is the third in our fall webinar series that will be held on October 12th. It's on reporting and investigating elder financial exploitation. So you'll hear from people in Adult Protective Services about what happens when they get a report of elder financial exploitation and how does it move from reporting to investigation. You'll hear from a whole panel of experts on that on the 12th at 2 o'clock Eastern time. We also want to make sure you know about these resources about how to find a network in your area. These are elder justice networks that work together amongst APS, financial institutions, law enforcement, and more to try to stop elder financial exploitation. You can also check out the CFPB's online network development guide at consumerfinance.gov/elder networks, and you'll find the link there too to all of the videos of the prior webinars if you want to check them out. And then we have a series of memoranda to financial institutions and law enforcement, FinCEN advisory, and Elder Justice Network videos. And with that, I want to thank Cora for her presentation today and for sharing these resources. And thank you all for attending. We hope you will take these resources into your community and help us in the fight to prevent elder financial exploitation. Thank you all and have a good day.